11 people, 6 dead, 5 missing. All of them spent their careers inside the most classified corners of American science: nuclear weapons labs, NASA propulsion, plasma fusion, anti-gravity research. And on April 20th, 2026, Congress quietly demanded answers in 7 days. The same day, America's most prominent UFO disclosure advocate turned up dead in Colorado. Coincidence is a word people use when they cannot explain a pattern, but patterns do not lie. They accumulate, and this one has been accumulating for a while. Before you decide what to believe, you need to see exactly what these 11 people were working on, because what they knew might be the most dangerous scientific secret in American history. Stay with me until the end. This one changes everything. Before we get into it, if you are new here, hit like and subscribe, because we are tracking every piece of this: the researchers who vanished without a trace, the classified programs hiding in plain sight, the congressional deadline that came out of nowhere, and if these 11 people really were close to something that someone decided the rest of us should never know about. You will want to be here when that truth finally cracks open. Now, settle in and let's begin. On April 20th, 2026, 3 separate letters landed on 3 separate desks inside 3 separate federal agencies, and none of them were supposed to exist yet. The House Oversight Committee, one of the most powerful investigative bodies in the United States Congress, sent formal written demands to the FBI, NASA, and the Department of Energy. The subject line, according to circulating accounts, concerned a cluster of researchers, scientists, administrators, military personnel who had either died under unclear circumstances or simply stopped being findable. Gone. No forwarding address. No goodbye. 1 week. That was the deadline. Respond in 1 week. April 27th. Now here's the first thing you need to sit with. No publicly verifiable copy of these letters has surfaced. No official congressional record. No press release. No leak to a mainstream outlet with a name attached to it. You cannot go to congress.gov right now and pull these documents up. And that matters, because real congressional inquiries are typically a matter of public record. They get filed. They get indexed. They show up. That is how oversight is supposed to work. So you already have attention before we have even started the story. Either something is being deliberately suppressed at a speed that would be genuinely unprecedented, or we are watching a narrative assemble itself out of fragments that feel true without being verified. Both of those possibilities are interesting, for very different reasons. The same day these letters allegedly went out, reports began circulating online about the death of a man described as the most prominent UFO disclosure advocate in America, found near Nederland, Colorado, a small mountain town west of Boulder. His name has circulated in those reports. His death has not been confirmed by major news outlets. The cause has not been officially stated. And yet by the evening of April 20th, the story had already reached hundreds of thousands of people across social media, threaded together with the congressional letters and a White House statement about a joint federal probe that may or may not have said what people claimed it said. There is a phrase investigators use when multiple signals arrive at the same moment from different directions: convergence point. It means either you are at the center of something real, or you have wandered into a place where your brain is doing what human brains do best, finding shape in static. 6 dead. 5 missing. That is the number attached to this story. 11 people, all of them allegedly connected to the most classified edges of American science and military research. And somewhere in the next 7 days, according to the people pushing this narrative hardest, something is supposed to happen. A briefing, a release, a disclosure. The question you should be asking right now is not whether any of this is true. The question is, why does it feel plausible? Because before we go any further, We need to find out whether these 11 people even form a real group, or whether someone built a group out of coincidence and called it a conspiracy. Let us assume, for the sake of following this properly, that the 11 are real, because even in an unverified narrative, the structure of the claim tells you something. The people described in this story are not random. They are not a group of elementary school teachers or retail managers or accountants. The alleged cluster breaks down into recognizable categories, and those categories are specific enough to be worth examining carefully. You have military oversight, specifically, a retired Air Force Major General described as having run America's most secretive program oversight committee before disappearing from his own home in New Mexico. You have civilian science, a NASA materials director who vanished on a hiking trail without a sound, no phone signal lost, no distress call, no body recovered. You have administrative access, a Los Alamos National Laboratory assistant whose personal and work phones were reportedly wiped to factory settings before she disappeared. A person whose job was not to do the research, but to know where the research lived. Then you have the outliers that push the story into stranger territory. An anti-gravity researcher in Alabama. A plasma fusion director at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Those two descriptions alone will make a certain kind of person's ears prick up, because those fields sit right at the edge of what conventional physics publicly acknowledges and what speculative physics has been arguing about for decades. Geographically, the cluster spans New Mexico, Alabama, Massachusetts, and Colorado. And if you are drawing a map and you want to find a common thread between those locations, you do not have to look very hard. New Mexico gives you Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories. Alabama gives you Redstone Arsenal and the Marshall Space Flight Center. Massachusetts gives you MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center. Colorado gives you multiple Department of Energy and Air Force Research Laboratory connections. These are not random dots. These dots sit on the same institutional web. The fields that keep appearing across these 11 alleged cases are energy systems, advanced materials, science, and aerospace propulsion. And here's what makes that combination genuinely interesting, rather than just alarming. Those three fields are not parallel tracks. They are the same track at different zoom levels. You cannot build a next-generation propulsion system without breakthrough materials. You cannot power that system without breakthrough energy. They are interlocked. Progress in one changes the ceiling of all three. So here is the question that the structure of this story actually raises, regardless of whether the 11 are real individuals or a constructed narrative. Is this a network of people who knew each other, collaborated, and were eliminated? Or is it a category overlap? A bunch of people who happen to work in adjacent areas of classified science, and someone drew a circle around them after the fact? The answer to that question changes everything about how you interpret what happens next. Because if it is a real network, there is a center. And if there is a center, there is something at the center worth protecting. Here's where a responsible narrator has to pump the brakes. Not because the story isn't gripping, but because gripping stories are exactly where your critical thinking needs to show up. There is no verified, publicly available list of 11 named individuals confirmed missing or dead by any mainstream news organization as of the recording of this episode. There is no consistent reporting thread across outlets that have editorial standards and fact-checking processes. What exists is a dense web of social media posts, anonymous forum threads, and secondary aggregators, each one citing the last one, each one adding a detail, each one slightly more specific than the post before it. That is not how verified journalism works. That is how narrative construction works. There is a phenomenon that researchers who study misinformation call narrative compression. It is the process by which multiple separate, unrelated events get collapsed into a single story through the act of juxtaposition. Someone dies in Colorado. Someone goes missing in New Mexico. A congressional letter gets mentioned in a forum. A disclosure advocate's name appears in a thread. None of these events were originally reported as connected, but once someone places them next to each other and gives the collection a title, 11 Missing Scientists, the human brain starts treating them as a unified event. We are extraordinarily good at that. Too good sometimes. Social media algorithms make this worse, not better. Content that triggers curiosity and mild anxiety spreads faster than content that resolves it. A post that says 6 scientists are dead and here is why will outperform a post that says here are some unrelated events that happened near each other by an order of magnitude. The architecture of modern information distribution is, whether intentionally or not, optimized for exactly this kind of narrative. But here is where it would be intellectually dishonest to simply stop and say misinformation, moving on. Because some of the most significant true stories in history started as unverified, socially amplified, institutional silence-surrounded rumors. Classified science is, by definition, low transparency. When official channels go quiet, speculation does not go quiet with them. It gets louder. There is a reason the phrase information vacuum exists. Nature abhors one. And in the absence of official confirmation or denial, the vacuum fills with whatever fits the shape of the hole. So the real question to hold on to is not, is this story true? The real question is, why does it feel so plausible that millions of people encountered it and did not immediately dismiss it? The answer to that question is not about these 11 people at all. The answer is about the research they are allegedly connected to, and about how sensitive that research actually is. Because that part, whatever else is uncertain here, is very real indeed. The Department of Energy is not, on the surface, a glamorous institution. It sounds like a utility board, the kind of agency that sends you pamphlets about insulating your attic. But the Department of Energy is also the primary civilian oversight body for the United States nuclear weapons complex, which means it sits directly above Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and several other facilities whose full activities are not available for public review. The Department of Energy is the organization that knows where the warheads are. It is also the organization overseeing the most ambitious energy research in human history, and those two things are not as separate as they might sound. Fusion energy is the cleaner, stranger, more powerful cousin of the fission reactions that power nuclear weapons. Where fission splits atoms apart and releases energy, fusion pushes them together. It is what the sun does. It is what hydrogen bombs do in their most violent moments, and it is what humanity has been trying to do in a controlled, sustained, useful way for roughly 70 years. The ITER project in France, the National Ignition Facility in California, these are the public-facing attempts. In December 2022, the National Ignition Facility achieved what they called ignition, a fusion reaction that produced more energy than the laser energy used to start it. It was a genuine milestone. It was also, researchers were quick to note, still nowhere near commercial viability. The gap between scientific proof of concept and engineered power system is enormous. But here is why that matters for this story. Fusion research exists on a dual-use spectrum. The same high-energy density physics that could give us clean, essentially limitless power also has weapons applications, propulsion applications, and classified applications that nobody outside certain clearance levels ever reads about. Inertial confinement fusion, the technique the National Ignition Facility uses, is inherently connected to weapons simulation programs that replaced live nuclear testing after the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. These programs are classified. The researchers who work in them hold clearances. And the breakthroughs that happen inside them do not get announced at press conferences. If multiple researchers were approaching a significant threshold in high energy density physics, a real breakthrough, not a marginal improvement. That information would almost certainly not be in any public database. It would not be in a journal article. It would exist in the kind of document that requires a specific clearance and a specific need to know to even acknowledge the existence of. And a person who understood the implications of that breakthrough, who had seen it, verified it, perhaps disagreed about what to do with it, would carry that knowledge without any public trace. That is the energy piece. It is real. The sensitivity is real. The classification structures around it are real. Whether any of the 11 were actually near such a threshold is unconfirmed and possibly entirely fabricated. But the conditions that would make such a story plausible, those are completely genuine, and propulsion is where things get considerably stranger. NASA's propulsion research portfolio is more diverse than most people realize. The image most people hold of NASA propulsion is the Saturn V rocket, a glorious, deafening, chemically powered monument to controlled explosion. And chemical propulsion is still the primary means of getting things off the surface of the Earth. But NASA's advanced propulsion research has moved well beyond that frame. Ion drives, which use electric fields to accelerate charged particles and produce thrust, have been flying on spacecraft since the late 1990s. The Dawn mission used one. The Hayabusa missions used them. They are slow to build thrust, but extraordinarily efficient over long distances. Plasma propulsion systems take that concept further, using superheated ionized gas to generate thrust in ways that blur the line between propulsion engineering and plasma physics. Then there is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. If you have spent any time in UFO research circles, and if you are watching this channel, statistically, some of you have, you already know the name. Wright-Patterson carries a specific weight in American conspiracy history. It is where the Roswell materials were allegedly sent in 1947, according to decades of claims. It is home to the Air Force Materiel Command and the Air Force Research Laboratory. It is a real facility with real classified programs in materials, science, aerospace systems, and propulsion research. The association with UFO lore is old enough and persistent enough that it has become almost impossible to discuss the base's legitimate research without the lore bleeding in. That is worth acknowledging, because it is also worth separating. Anti-gravity as a field of engineering does not currently exist in any publicly confirmed operational form. That is not a statement about what is or is not possible. That is a statement about what has been publicly verified. Within general relativity, gravity is a curvature of space-time, not a force in the classical sense, which means that theoretically, manipulating space-time geometry could produce something that looked, from the outside, like anti-gravitational propulsion. The mathematics exist. The engineering to implement those mathematics at any useful scale does not exist publicly. There have been serious physicists who have published theoretical work on space-time metric manipulation, the Alcubierre drive concept being the most famous. And there have been programs like the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, whose existence the Pentagon confirmed in 2017, that investigated whether observed UAP flight characteristics could be explained by known or theorized physics. Here's the open question that program leaves behind. What did they find? Because the program was classified, then partially acknowledged, then restructured under different names. The conclusion they published publicly was essentially, we don't know. But classified programs that produce a public conclusion of we don't know do not necessarily share their full findings in that public conclusion. They are not required to. And the flight characteristics observed in the declassified UAP videos released by the Navy, the rapid acceleration, the apparent absence of a heat signature, the movement against wind at altitude, are not consistent with any propulsion system that has been publicly described as operational. Whether any human research program has independently developed technology that explains those observations is unknown. Whether the researchers in this alleged cluster of 11 were anywhere near such a program is unconfirmed. But the field is real. The sensitivity is real. And the gap between what is publicly known and what might exist inside classified programs is wide enough to park something very large inside it. What that something requires above all else is the right materials. And that brings us somewhere most people never think to look. Materials science does not get thrillers written about it. It does not inspire the kind of fevered forum speculation that fusion reactors and anti-gravity do. It is the part of advanced engineering that hides in plain sight, and that is precisely what makes it the most strategically important field on this list. Every physical system, no matter how theoretically sophisticated its design, runs into the same brutal constraint. It has to be built out of something. That something has to survive the conditions the system creates. For aerospace applications, those conditions are severe. Hypersonic flight, sustained travel at Mach 5 or above, generates surface temperatures that will destroy conventional metals and composites within seconds. The thermal and mechanical stresses at those speeds are not engineering challenges in the ordinary sense. They are fundamental physical limits. The reason the United States, China, and Russia are in an active hypersonic arms race right now is not because the guidance systems are hard, though they are. It is because building a vehicle that can survive its own flight profile for long enough to be useful is a materials problem that nobody has fully solved. Metamaterials are one of the more remarkable concepts to emerge from materials research in the last 30 years. A metamaterial is an engineered structure whose properties come not from its chemical composition, but from its physical architecture, the way its components are arranged at a scale smaller than the wavelength of whatever you are trying to interact with. Metamaterials have been demonstrated that bend light around objects, making them invisible to specific frequencies. They have been used to create acoustic cloaks. They have been theorized as the key component in certain space-time manipulation concepts, because a material that can interact with electromagnetic radiation in structured ways might, at sufficient scale and energy, interact with gravitational fields. That last part is theoretical, very theoretical. But the line between theoretical physics and classified engineering programs is not always as clean as academic publication makes it appear. The National Reconnaissance Office, DARPA, and the various service branch research laboratories have funded research that, when it produces results, does not necessarily get published. A materials breakthrough that enables hypersonic flight profiles currently considered impossible, or that reduces the radar and thermal signature of an aerospace vehicle below current detection thresholds, would be among the most protected scientific achievements in the country. A person who had achieved it, or who had seen it achieved, would be carrying information of extraordinary strategic value. So when you look at the alleged cluster of 11, and you see fields like NASA Materials Directorship, Los Alamos Administrative Access, and advanced aerospace research, the thing that connects them is not a conspiracy theory. The thing that connects them is the physical reality that energy systems, propulsion, and materials science are three legs of the same stool. You cannot advance one without the others. Progress in all three simultaneously, in a classified environment, in the same general time frame, would not be a coincidence. It would be a program. And the question that follows from that, the one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up slightly if you follow the logic all the way through, is what do you do when the program produces something that changes the rules entirely? And more urgently, what is the April 27th deadline actually pointing at? 1 week. That is what the alleged congressional letters demanded. 1 week for the FBI, NASA, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense to assemble a briefing, produce documentation, and appear before the House Oversight Committee on a cluster of disappearances and deaths connected to classified research. April 20th to April 27th. 7 days. If you have spent any time watching how Congress actually functions, and I say this with all the affection of someone who has read a lot of congressional procedure documents, so you do not have to, you know that 1 week is not a real timeline for a federal agency response to a serious oversight inquiry. It is simply not how the machinery works. A formal congressional request for documentation from a major agency typically produces an initial response acknowledging receipt, followed by weeks or months of document review, legal counsel consultation, and interagency coordination before anything substantive appears. Major oversight hearings are announced well in advance. Witnesses are scheduled. Subpoenas, when necessary, move through a legal process. A 7-day window from letter to briefing, involving 4 separate federal agencies plus alleged White House coordination, is not a realistic bureaucratic timeline. That inconsistency does not automatically mean the letters are fake. It might mean the letters are informal communications rather than formal subpoenas, more of a political pressure move than a legal instrument. Or it might mean the timeline is what researchers who study viral narratives call a narrative anchor, a specific date planted in a story to create urgency, to give the audience a moment to wait for, to transform a sprawling, ambiguous conspiracy into something with a countdown. Deadlines do something very specific to human psychology. They create anticipation, which creates continued engagement. A story that says something might happen eventually loses people on day 3. A story that says something happens April 27th keeps people checking their feeds every morning until the date arrives. There is also a third possibility worth sitting with, which is that something real does happen on or around April 27th. Not necessarily the dramatic congressional disclosure people are expecting, but some piece of partial information, some document release, some official acknowledgement that can be retrospectively framed as confirmation of the larger narrative. That is actually the most interesting scenario, because it is the one that would be hardest to evaluate clearly in real time. When you are primed to expect confirmation, partial information looks like confirmation. Here is what is unambiguously, verifiably real. The United States Department of Defense has acknowledged over the last decade that unidentified aerial phenomena are real objects observed by trained military personnel using calibrated instruments, and that a significant number of those observations cannot be explained by currently known technology. That acknowledgement came in stages. The release of 3 declassified UAP videos in 2017 and 2020. The establishment of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office in 2022. The congressional UAP hearings in 2022 and 2023, where military witnesses testified under oath about observations they could not account for. The NASA UAP Independent Study Team report in 2023, which called for a systematic scientific approach to the phenomenon. What the government has not confirmed, and what no official document has stated, is that any of these phenomena represent non-human intelligence, extraterrestrial origin, or recovered technology of unknown provenance. The official position remains, broadly, we observe things we cannot explain, and we are studying them. That is a genuinely significant shift from 20 years ago, when the official position was essentially nothing to see here. But it is not disclosure in the sense that the word has come to mean in certain communities, a single definitive moment when the government says, yes, there is something else out there, and here is what we know about it. The gap between where official acknowledgement currently sits and where public expectation of disclosure sits is enormous, and that gap is not static. Every partial release, every congressional hearing, every leaked document or anonymous government whistleblower creates a new expectation of the next step, a step that always feels imminent and never quite arrives. Former intelligence officer David Grush testified before Congress in 2023 that the U.S. government possesses non-human intelligence craft and biological material of non-human origin. That testimony was given under oath. The government has neither confirmed nor specifically denied the claims. The investigation continues, and the public is left in a state of permanent almost knowing, which is genuinely one of the most psychologically destabilizing states a person can occupy around a topic this consequential. It is exactly that state, the almost knowing, that creates the perfect environment for a story like the 11 missing scientists to take hold, spread, and feel immediately credible to millions of people who are already primed to believe that something significant is being withheld. Let me show you the mechanism, because understanding it is the only way to navigate this clearly. When a topic is simultaneously high stakes and low transparency, meaning people care intensely, but official information is scarce, a very predictable information ecosystem develops. The official channel goes quiet, or speaks in bureaucratic language that is deliberately unspecific. The unofficial channels fill immediately, not with fabrications necessarily, though fabrications appear. With pattern matching. Humans encountering incomplete information do not wait patiently for completion. They complete it themselves, using every available analogy and prior experience, and the completion feels like discovery rather than construction. There is a documented cognitive phenomenon called the clustering illusion, which is the tendency to perceive patterns in genuinely random sequences. If you flip a coin 100 times, you will almost certainly produce sequences of 6 or 7 heads in a row. Those sequences are not meaningful. They are statistically inevitable given enough trials. But if you observe only those sequences, they look like evidence of manipulation. The question is always, what is the sample size? How many researchers work in classified energy, propulsion, and materials science in the United States? Thousands. Tens of thousands if you include contractors, clearance holders, academic consultants, and administrative staff, across a population that large deaths and disappearances occur. They occur randomly for personal, medical, accidental, and statistical reasons. Selecting a handful of those events, connecting them by field rather than by name, and presenting them as a cluster is not analysis, it is curation. Social media does not reward the person who says, actually the base rate of scientist deaths in any given month makes this cluster statistically unremarkable. That person gets 14 views and a polite nod. The person who says 6 dead, 5 missing, something is being hidden, gets 3 million views and a trending hashtag by morning. The architecture selects for urgency and pattern, not for calibration. And once a story reaches a certain velocity, it becomes almost impossible to debunk in real time, not because the debunking is wrong, but because the story is moving faster than the verification can follow. None of which means the story is wrong. That is the honest part. Some stories that spread this way turn out to be real. Sometimes the pattern was a pattern. Sometimes the silence was silence for a reason. The way you tell the difference is not speed, it is evidence. Specific names, official documents, consistent reporting from independent sources with editorial accountability. And we have seen, historically, what happens when you apply that standard to stories like this one. Because this is not the first cluster. Not even close. In the mid-1980s, a series of deaths among engineers and scientists connected to a British defense contractor called Marconi Electronic Systems began to accumulate in the British press. Over roughly a 3-year period, more than 20 people associated with the company and with UK defense electronics programs died under circumstances that were individually ruled accidental, suicidal, or from natural causes, but which, placed together, attracted significant journalistic attention. These were not obscure figures. They worked on advanced radar systems, electronic warfare, and what was then called the Strategic Defense Initiative, Ronald Reagan's missile defense program, which the British press called Star Wars. The coverage at the time was extensive and genuinely alarmed. Some journalists and former colleagues publicly questioned whether the deaths were coincidental. The Soviet intelligence service, the KGB, was frequently invoked as a possible actor, given the strategic sensitivity of the work and the Cold War context. Members of Parliament asked questions. Investigations were opened. What those investigations consistently found when they concluded was no evidence of coordinated targeting, no confirmed common cause, and no actionable intelligence suggesting a systematic elimination program. Individual cases had individual explanations: stress-related medical events, accidents, personal crises. The clustering was real in the sense that the individuals shared an employer and a research domain. The clustering was not real in the sense of reflecting a coordinated external action. And yet the Marconi deaths remain a persistent feature of conspiracy literature decades later, because the investigations could not prove a negative. You cannot prove that no one was targeting these scientists. You can only fail to find evidence that anyone was. And in a world where classified programs exist, that failure of evidence is always ambiguous. That ambiguity never fully resolves, and unresolved ambiguity is where conspiracy narratives live forever. The lesson here is not clusters are always false. The lesson is that a real cluster requires more than proximity of profession and proximity in time. It requires evidence of connection. And before we found that evidence in the Marconi case, we were certain we had already found the pattern. In the months following the anthrax letter attacks of October 2001, a separate and largely unrelated pattern began to be noticed and reported. Within roughly 18 months of the attacks, a significant number of prominent microbiologists and infectious disease researchers died under various circumstances: accidents, apparent suicides, violent crimes. The count varied depending on who was doing the counting, with some lists reaching into the double digits. The framing was nearly identical to what we see today. These were not random people. They were specialists in exactly the field relevant to a national security crisis, and they were dying at a rate and in circumstances that invited scrutiny. The context made it feel especially urgent. The anthrax letters had killed 5 people, infected 17 others, shut down congressional offices, and triggered the largest FBI investigation in American history at that point. The country was less than 2 months past September 11th. The idea that the people who understood anthrax best were now themselves being eliminated was not just frightening, it felt coherent. It fit a narrative that the country was already living inside. Subsequent analysis of the alleged cluster revealed something instructive. The deaths, when examined individually and against base rate data on mortality in the biomedical research community, a community of many hundreds of thousands of professionals, were not statistically anomalous. Some were genuinely tragic. Some were coincidental in timing. The connection to anthrax research specifically was, in most cases, either absent or extremely tenuous. The clustering effect was produced by the act of searching. Once you decide to look for dead microbiologists in a given time frame, you will find them. Because microbiologists are a large population, and people in large populations die. The anthrax cluster is a near-perfect illustration of what psychologists call hindsight bias operating in real time. The way that a context of fear reshapes the interpretation of information that would otherwise be unremarkable. When you are afraid that something is happening, ambiguous evidence stops being ambiguous. It becomes confirmation. And you remember the cases that fit the pattern, while the ones that did not fit quietly fall out of the narrative. The story you are left with at the end is coherent and alarming and much smaller than the actual dataset it was drawn from. This one is, frankly, the most instructive cautionary tale in the history of this specific genre of conspiracy narrative, and I want you to pay attention to how it unfolded, because the structure is almost identical to what we are watching in April 2026. In the summer of 2015, a series of social media posts began circulating about an apparent cluster of holistic medicine practitioners and alternative health doctors who had died within a short period. The original posts cited around 8 deaths. By the time the story had circulated for several weeks, lists of over 60 names were being compiled and shared. The framing was consistent. These were doctors who knew something about natural medicine, who threatened pharmaceutical industry interests, who were being systematically eliminated before they could spread their knowledge. The story spread with remarkable speed. It was shared by millions of people across multiple platforms. It was picked up by alternative health media outlets with large audiences. It generated genuine fear among practitioners in that community. And it had just enough specific detail, names, dates, locations, to feel thoroughly researched. When journalists and fact-checkers applied actual scrutiny to the list, what they found was revealing. The 60-plus names included people who had died of cancer, heart attacks, and strokes, the leading causes of death in the American adult population. It included elderly individuals whose deaths were not remotely suspicious. It included deaths that had occurred years apart and were grouped together by the act of inclusion in the same list. When you filtered for cases that were actually unexplained or genuinely unusual, the number dropped to a small handful, none of which could be connected to each other by any confirmed relationship or shared research interest. The narrative had been constructed after the fact. Individual data points had been selected and placed in proximity. The selection criteria were circular. A death was suspicious if it was a holistic doctor, and it was included because it was suspicious. The list grew because the story demanded a list, not because the deaths demanded explanation. By the time serious debunking arrived, the story had already completed its viral life cycle. Millions of people who encountered the original claim never encountered the correction. The misinformation had escaped the correction, the way a ship escapes the harbor. By the time you close the gate, it is already in open water. That is the mechanism. That is the full life cycle. And knowing it does not make you immune to it, it just gives you slightly better odds of noticing when you are inside it. Which means now, with that framework in hand, we are ready to apply it directly to the question of what is actually happening with these 11. Let us start with the most boring explanation, which is often the most accurate one. The United States government employs, contracts with, and academically affiliates with a vast number of researchers, scientists, engineers, and administrators who hold security clearances and work in sensitive fields. The Department of Energy alone oversees facilities employing tens of thousands of people. NASA employs roughly 18,000, with many times that number in contractor relationships. The combined workforce of people who could, in a sufficiently broad description, be described as working near classified energy, propulsion, or materials research runs well into the hundreds of thousands. Across a population that large, statistically significant numbers of people die and go missing every year. They die of cancer, of cardiovascular disease, of accidents on trails and roads, of the full spectrum of causes that claim human lives in the ordinary course of living them. Some of those people disappear, not because they are eliminated, but because people in mental health crises disappear. People fleeing domestic situations disappear. People whose lives have become unbearable. In quiet ways, sometimes walk away from them without telling anyone. The clustering illusion is not a character flaw. It is a feature of human cognition that evolved in an environment where pattern detection was a survival advantage. If your ancestors saw a shape in the tall grass that might be a predator, the cost of false positives, running when nothing was there, was low. The cost of a false negative, not running when something was there, was death. So we evolved to see patterns. We are extraordinarily good at it. We are so good at it that we see patterns in genuinely random noise, consistently, across cultures, across ages, across levels of education. Flipping a coin 20 times and getting 7 heads in a row does not mean the coin is rigged. It means you have flipped a coin 20 times. Selecting 12 researchers from a population of hundreds of thousands who have died or gone missing in a calendar year and calling it a cluster does not mean there is a conspiracy. It means you have selected 12 data points from a large data set using criteria that guaranteed you would find what you were looking for. The question that selection bias analysis always demands is, what is the denominator? How many researchers in these fields did not die or disappear? If the answer is thousands, then the cluster dissolves into the base rate, and what looked like signal was always noise. The second explanation is subtler, and I would argue, more interesting than simple coincidence. It does not require a conspiracy to explain the feeling of conspiracy. It only requires the structural features of classified government research as they actually exist. When a government program is classified, the people working on it cannot discuss it. They cannot confirm or deny the program exists. They cannot explain their work to family members, to journalists, to members of Congress who do not have the appropriate clearances. When something goes wrong inside a classified program, when a researcher dies or disappears, the official response is constrained by classification in ways that produce exactly the behavior you would expect from a cover-up, even when there is nothing being covered up beyond the program's existence. An Air Force general who ran a classified oversight program and then died of a heart attack cannot be memorialized in a press release that mentions his actual work. His colleagues cannot give interviews about what he was doing. His family receives condolences that are careful about specificity. From the outside, that looks like suppression. From the inside, it is compliance with classification requirements that exist for legitimate national security reasons. This is the black box effect. When you encounter a sealed container, you fill it with whatever your prior beliefs and fears suggest it might contain. A classified program that produces public silence around a researcher's death will, in an environment of intense public interest in government secrecy, be interpreted as confirmation of exactly what the observer most suspected. The silence is real. The secrecy is real. But the inference drawn from that silence, that it conceals something extraordinary, is not logically required by the silence itself. Real secrecy and the imagined contents of that secrecy are very different things. One exists. The other is a projection. The challenge is that from the outside, they look identical. And then there is the third explanation, the one I have been deliberately holding back. The one that does not resolve neatly into either coincidence or misunderstanding. The one that requires you to hold a very uncomfortable possibility at arm's length and look at it clearly without either dismissing it or embracing it. What if some version of this is real? Not necessarily all of it. Not the full narrative as it has circulated, with every detail intact and every claim verified. But some version, a smaller, quieter, more specific version, where a genuine network of researchers in overlapping classified fields had arrived, collectively or independently, at a threshold that someone in a position of institutional power considered too dangerous, too destabilizing, or too valuable to allow to propagate freely. The only fields that produce that scenario plausibly are, as we have established, the intersection of energy systems, propulsion research, and advanced materials. A simultaneous breakthrough in all three, or even a credible indication that such a breakthrough was near, would represent a strategic discontinuity. It would mean that the physical rules governing what is and is not possible in aerospace, energy generation, and weapons development had shifted. The implications would be enormous, and the impulse to contain that information, at least temporarily, at least until its strategic implications could be assessed, would be entirely predictable from any government that had the means to act on that impulse. This is not a claim that this happened. There is no evidence that it happened. The 11 may not be a real group. The congressional letters may not exist in the form described. The Colorado death may have nothing to do with any of this, but the scenario is not physically impossible. It is not even particularly improbable, given what classified research actually looks like when it accelerates. It is simply unconfirmed, and unconfirmed is not the same as false. It just means that what happens next matters enormously, and that the date on the calendar is almost here. April 27th is either a real event horizon or it is not. Those are the only two options, and by the time you are watching this episode, you may already know which one it was. But let us think through both outcomes carefully, because the result either way is more interesting than it first appears. If nothing happens on April 27th, no congressional briefing, no document release, no official acknowledgement, no names confirmed, no letters verified, then the narrative will not simply collapse. It will adapt. The date will be reframed as a failed attempt at suppression, as a deadline that was ignored rather than one that never existed, as evidence that the story is real precisely because nothing was allowed to happen. This is the standard behavioral response of a narrative that cannot be falsified, and it is worth recognizing it clearly. An unfalsifiable narrative is not a conspiracy theory with strong evidence. It is a conspiracy theory that has removed the mechanism for disconfirmation. That is not strength. That is a closed loop. If something does happen, even something partial, even a document release, or a congressional statement that touches only tangentially on the subjects described, the opposite problem emerges. Partial confirmation in a primed information environment gets processed as full confirmation. A statement that says, "We are aware of a cluster of deaths among government-affiliated researchers and are reviewing available information," is not confirmation that the 11 are real, that they were connected, that they were eliminated, or that a classified breakthrough was involved. But it will be received as all of those things by a significant portion of the audience that has been following this story. The cleanest outcome, epistemically speaking, would be specific official documentation, named individuals, confirmed causes of death or disappearance, verified congressional correspondence. That outcome would allow real evaluation. It would tell us whether the narrative was largely accurate, largely fabricated, or somewhere in the genuinely complex middle. That outcome is also, historically, the rarest one. What usually happens is ambiguity. And ambiguity, by now, you know what to do with. Let me give you the actual framework, not the emotional one, not the one your pattern-seeking brain will try to use. The analyst framework, the one that intelligence professionals and investigative journalists use when they are trying to separate real signal from constructed narrative in real time. First, names matter. Specific, verifiable names attached to specific, verifiable events. An anonymous source describing a general's disappearance is qualitatively different from a named individual whose absence can be confirmed through public records, family statements, or official response. Every time a story resists naming, ask why. Sometimes the answer is source protection. Sometimes the answer is that the person does not exist. Second, documents over descriptions. Anyone can describe what a congressional letter says. The letter itself, or a verifiable photograph of it, or a congressional record number that can be checked, is a different category of evidence entirely. If the only form a document takes is someone's account of what it contains, you are working with testimony, not documentation. Testimony can be accurate. It can also be constructed. Third, independent confirmation matters more than quantity. 1,000 social media posts citing the same original source are not 1,000 confirmations. They are one source replicated 1,000 times. Two independent reporters at different outlets with different source networks arriving at the same factual claim by different routes. That is confirmation. Chase the origin, not the volume. Fourth, ignore anonymous urgency. Posts, videos, and threads that claim insider knowledge, imminent releases, and immediate danger without providing any verifiable supporting material are the lowest quality inputs in any information environment. They feel credible because specificity mimics research, but specificity without verifiability is just fiction that knows its genre well. What you are tracking, if you want to track this honestly, is the documentary record, official statements, verifiable names, public records, and the behavior of institutional actors over the coming days and weeks. Everything else is the information equivalent of weather. It feels significant while you are inside it, and means much less than you thought once it has passed. Let me bring you back to April 20th, 2026. Multiple signals arrive simultaneously. A congressional demand, an alleged death, a federal probe announced, a countdown timer set, 11 figures at the intersection of classified science and military research, either dead or missing, depending on who you ask and what sources they are drawing from. Here is what I know with confidence. The research fields described in this story are real. They are sensitive, and the institutional secrecy surrounding them is genuine. The history of scientists dying in clusters, and those clusters meaning nothing beyond the base rate of human mortality, is also real. The history of government programs concealing information that would have changed public understanding of what is possible is also real. All three of those things are simultaneously true, and they occupy the same space, and they are genuinely difficult to tell apart from inside a news cycle that is moving at the speed of social media. The mystery you are watching may be real. It may be constructed. It may be a real thing that has been so thoroughly encrusted with constructed narrative that the real thing is no longer accessible without tools most people do not use. What I can tell you is that the question itself, what do we do with knowledge that is too dangerous to be public, is not a conspiracy theory. It is one of the oldest and most serious questions in the philosophy of science and governance. Robert Oppenheimer asked it. The scientists of the Manhattan Project asked it. Every researcher who has ever sat across from a classification officer and been told that their work belongs to the state, not to humanity, has lived inside that question. If 11 people really did arrive, together or separately, at something that changed the rules, something that explained the observations in the UAP videos, something that made the physics of the impossible suddenly look like engineering, then the question of what happens to them is not a small question. It is the question of what a civilization does when knowledge becomes a weapon before it can become a gift. And that question does not have a comfortable answer. It does not have any answer that leaves everyone safe, or everyone informed, or everyone in agreement about what should be done next. What happens on April 27th may tell us nothing, or it may tell us everything, or most likely, it will tell us just enough to make the question larger than it was before, the way real discoveries always do. The arc of this story, whatever its origin, points at something genuine. The growing, grinding tension between what governments know and what citizens are permitted to know, in a world where the technology being developed in classified programs may be the most consequential in human history. Whether these 11 people are real, or partially real, or entirely constructed, the world they allegedly inhabited is real. The sensitivity of the work is real, and the fact that you found this story plausible enough to spend an hour with it tells you something about where we are, collectively, as a civilization, trying to understand what is being built in the rooms we are not allowed to enter. The quiet archivist will be watching April 27th, and so I suspect will you.